The German recovery team reached the crash site within 90 minutes of Flickinger's wheels-up landing. Hauptmann Klaus Weber, chief engineer for Luftwaffe Technical Intelligence in occupied France, stood at the edge of the frozen field and felt his pulse quicken. After 3 years of war, after examining hundreds of shattered aircraft scattered across French countryside, he was looking at something unprecedented. An intact American heavy bomber, resting in the winter mud like a wounded giant that refused to die. "Mein Gott," whispered Oberleutnant Hans Faber, Weber's structural specialist, as they approached the downed fortress. "It's complete." And it was. Battle damage scarred the aluminum skin. Cannon strikes had punched holes through the fuselage. One engine nacelle showed fire damage. The belly turret had plowed a furrow through the earth, but the aircraft's structural integrity remained fundamentally sound. The wings hadn't buckled. The tail section stood intact. The control surfaces moved freely when Faber tested them. Most critically, 3 of the 4 Wright Cyclone engines appeared salvageable, possibly even operational with minor repairs. Weber's team moved with practiced efficiency, establishing a security perimeter, while photographer Feldwebel Ernst Hartmann began documenting every detail. The December light was fading fast, and Weber knew they had perhaps 2 hours before darkness made detailed examinations impossible. Moreover, French resistance operatives might attempt sabotage once word spread of the capture. Speed was essential. "Photograph everything before we touch anything," Weber ordered. "I want documentation of every gun position, every instrument, every piece of equipment in its original condition." His engineers spread through the aircraft like surgeons examining a living patient. Lieutenant Friedrich Brohn, the team's armament specialist, climbed into the bomber's waist section and found himself surrounded by machine gun mounts, ammunition feeds, and spent cartridge collection systems of sophisticated design. "Herr Hauptmann," he called down, his voice tight with excitement. "The defensive armament. It's beyond anything in our intelligence reports. The overlapping fields of fire. There's virtually no safe attack angle." In the cockpit, Faber studied the instrument panel with growing amazement. "The Americans have standardized everything. Look, every gauge, every switch, every control is logically positioned for rapid crew training. They're not building custom aircraft. They're building systems." Weber understood immediately what his structural specialist meant. German bombers like the Heinkel He 111 or Junkers Ju 88 required skilled craftsmen to hand-fit components during assembly. Each aircraft was subtly unique, but this B-17 demonstrated mass production philosophy perfected. Every part interchangeable, every system modular, every component designed for replacement rather than repair. By nightfall, Wehrmacht troops had established armed guard posts around the captured fortress. Hartmann had exposed 60 rolls of film, and Weber had completed his preliminary assessment for Luftwaffe headquarters in Berlin. Before we continue, click that subscribe button. Like this video and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It brings me great joy knowing that these war stories and lessons get to people all over the world. Your support helps us bring more thrilling war stories, and trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get back to the story. His report's final line would prove prophetic. "This aircraft represents not merely advanced enemy technology, but an industrial philosophy we cannot match. Recommend immediate transport to Rechlin for comprehensive evaluation." The implications extend far beyond tactical aviation. Within 36 hours, German mechanics had patched the battle damage sufficiently for flight. Wolfhound was going to Germany, and taking with it evidence of America's terrifying industrial supremacy. Rechlin Test Center, December 1942. The captured B-17 arrived under armed escort and immediately disappeared into Hangar 7, the facility's most secure evaluation bay. What followed was 3 months of systematic dissection that would fundamentally alter Luftwaffe understanding of American military philosophy. Oberingenieur Martin Schilling led the structural analysis team. A veteran of German aviation since the 1920s, he'd examined everything from obsolete biplanes to the latest jet prototypes. But within hours of beginning his inspection of Wolfhound, Schilling found himself confronting engineering decisions that contradicted every principle of German aircraft design. The armor plating alone weighs over 500 kilograms, he reported to the assembled technical staff on the third day of examination. They've protected the pilot, co-pilot, and top turret gunner with steel plate that would stop 7.92mm rounds at close range. Some sections will defeat even our 13mm machine guns. Lieutenant Dieter Kessler, the team's fuel systems specialist, had made an even more unsettling discovery. The fuel tanks are self-sealing, he announced, holding up a section of the rubberized bladder material. They've lined every tank with multiple layers of vulcanized rubber and synthetic compounds. When punctured, the material swells on contact with fuel, automatically plugging holes up to 13mm diameter. The implications rippled through the assembled engineers. German bombers used conventional metal fuel tanks. One good hit, and they burned. The Luftwaffe had lost hundreds of aircraft to fuel tank fires. But American bombers could absorb punishment that would incinerate a Heinkel Hi-111 or Dornier Do-217. They built it to take damage. We cannot survive, whispered Hauptmann Georg Richter, examining the hydraulic system schematics spread across the hangar floor. Richter's assessment was devastatingly accurate. The B-17's hydraulic controls featured complete redundancy, dual lines running to every critical system. Sever one hydraulic line, and the backup maintained function. The electrical system showed similar philosophy. Multiple circuit paths, redundant wiring bundles routed through separate sections of the fuselage. German bombers used single-path systems to save weight. American bombers accepted the weight penalty for survivability. Even the control surfaces revealed this systematic overbuilding. Schilling's team discovered that the B-17 could lose significant portions of its vertical stabilizer, horizontal stabilizers, or wing trailing edges and remain controllable. They'd seen photographic intelligence of battle-damaged B-17s returning to England with damage that should have made flight aerodynamically impossible. "It's not elegant," Schilling admitted during his formal briefing to Recklin's commanding officer. "It's heavy, nearly 2 tons heavier than our Ju-88 for similar payload capacity. It's slower. It trades performance for protection at every decision point." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But, Herr Oberst, they can afford those trade-offs because they're building these aircraft in quantities we cannot imagine. They've designed a bomber that average pilots can fly, that mechanics can repair quickly, that can sustain battle damage and bring crews home. They've optimized for production and survival rather than performance." The senior officer studied the technical drawings scattered across the briefing table. "And the defensive armament?" Schilling's expression darkened. "That, sir, requires a separate discussion. What we've discovered about their gunnery systems suggests our fighter tactics may be fundamentally compromised." Summer 1943, Hans-Werner Lerche arrived at Rechlin with a reputation that preceded him. At 27, he'd already logged more hours flying captured enemy aircraft than any pilot in the Luftwaffe. British Spitfires, Soviet Yak-1s, American P-38 Lightnings. Lerche had evaluated them all with clinical precision, cataloging performance characteristics and tactical vulnerabilities for German fighter squadrons. But the B-17 represented something different. Fighter evaluation meant understanding speed, maneuverability, climb rate, metrics that translated directly to combat advantage. Heavy bomber evaluation meant understanding philosophy, industrial capability, and strategic implications that extended far beyond individual aircraft performance. "There is no manual," Oberst Heinrich Bauer informed him during the pre-flight briefing. "The Americans don't leave technical documentation in their aircraft. You'll be working purely from observation and instinct." Lurchie nodded. He'd expected as much. "The engines? 3 of the original 4 Wright Cyclones are operational. We've scavenged parts from other captured radials to make them serviceable. They'll run, but we cannot guarantee reliability beyond 1 flight." That morning, Lurchie climbed aboard Wolfhound alone. No co-pilot, no flight engineer, no gunners, just one German test pilot and an American bomber he'd have to learn by touch. The cockpit felt spacious compared to German bombers, almost wastefully so. Room to move, visibility in all directions, controls positioned for comfort rather than compact efficiency. Lurchie settled into the left seat and began the systematic process of understanding the aircraft. Throttle quadrant, 4 levers, 1 for each engine. Mixture controls below them. Propeller pitch controls beside those. Logical. Straightforward. The Americans had designed it for pilots with minimal training, which meant even an experienced pilot could master it quickly. But the system's complexity revealed itself in layers. Fuel tank selectors controlled 18 separate tanks distributed throughout the wings and fuselage. Transfer pumps, cross-feed valves, fuel quantity gauges for each tank. The B-17 carried nearly 2,700 gallons of fuel, more than 3 times the capacity of a Ju-88. Electrical systems, generators on each engine, battery backup, circuit breakers organized by function. Hydraulic pressure gauges showed the dual redundant system Kessler's team had documented. Oxygen system controls for 10 crew positions. Intercom selector switches allowing the pilot to communicate with any crew station. Lurch spent an hour simply sitting, touching each control, memorizing positions, building the mental map he'd need once the engine started, and everything happened simultaneously. No co-pilot meant he'd manage 4 engines, navigate, monitor systems, and maintain formation discipline if German fighters joined him for comparative evaluation entirely alone. Finally, he reached for the engine start switches. The number 3 engine, starboard inboard, coughed twice, backfired once, then settled into a rattling idle. Number 4 followed more smoothly. Number 1 required 3 attempts before catching. Number 2 started cleanly. The entire airframe vibrated as 4,800 horsepower came alive. Through the cockpit windows, Lurchie saw reclean ground crew backing away, their faces upturned, watching Germany's most experienced test pilot prepare to fly America's most formidable bomber. He released the brakes. Wolfhound began to roll. The B-17 lifted off Recklin's main runway with a ponderous grace that surprised Lurch. He'd expected sluggish, truck-like handling, the characteristic of most heavy bombers. Instead, the Fortress rose steadily, the 4 Wright Cyclones pulling the massive airframe skyward with what felt less like effort and more like inevitability. At 1,500 meters, Lurch leveled off and began his evaluation. The first sensation was stability. German bombers like the He-111 required constant trim adjustments, small corrections, pilot attention to maintain level flight. The B-17 simply flew. Set the trim tabs, synchronized the engines, and the bomber held altitude and heading as if riding invisible rails through the sky. Lurch experimented with control inputs. Aileron response, steady, predictable, requiring moderate force. Elevator authority, positive, with no tendency toward over-control. Rudder, powerful enough to compensate for single-engine failure, critical for a 4-engine design. Everything about the aircraft's handling suggested it had been designed for pilots with minimal training to fly in conditions of extreme stress and battle damage. He advanced the throttles. The bomber accelerated with surprising willingness, reaching 290 kilometers per hour in level flight. Not fast by fighter standards, not even fast by German bomber standards, but respectable for an aircraft weighing 30 tons fully loaded. More importantly, the engines ran smoothly at cruise power, their synchronized rhythm vibrating through the airframe with mechanical confidence. This was endurance, not speed. Raw force, not agility. The B-17 wasn't built to outrun fighters or outturn interceptors. It was built to reach the target despite opposition, absorb punishment, and bring crews home. Lerche banked gently, feeling the bomber respond with stable predictability. The visibility was remarkable. Greenhouse nose panels offering panoramic forward view, side windows providing excellent situational awareness. American bomber crews could see threats developing from nearly any direction, which brought him to the thought he'd been avoiding. Slowly, Lerche turned in his seat and looked aft through the cockpit door. The gun positions stared back at him. Empty now. No gunners. No ammunition. But the emplacements remained, silent and somehow menacing. He could see the top turret directly behind his position, its twin 50-caliber mounts covering the upper hemisphere. Further back, the radio room gun opening. Beyond that, the ball turret mounting point in the belly, the waist gun windows on each side, and finally, the tail gunner's isolated position at the extreme rear of the fuselage. Lerche had read the technical reports. He'd studied the armament schematics, but seeing the actual positions from the pilot's seat, understanding how the fields of fire overlapped, how every approach angle intersected with multiple gun positions, transformed abstract intelligence into visceral comprehension. No wonder our fighter pilots report such casualties, he thought. A Bf-109 attacking from 6 o'clock high would face the tail guns and top turret. From level stern, tail guns and waist guns. From below, ball turret, waist guns, and potentially the tail position. From the beam, both waist guns with overlapping fire. Even head-on attacks, previously considered the safest approach, would encounter the nose guns and potentially the top turret tracking forward. Lerche flew onward, alone in the sky, piloting a fortress that suddenly felt less like an aircraft and more like a flying statement of intent. We will reach the target, and we will make you bleed for every meter. 2 weeks after Lerche's initial flight, Recklin's gunnery analysis team presented their findings to assembled Luftwaffe fighter group commanders. Hauptmann Werner Bach, chief of defensive armament evaluation, stood before a life-size diagram of the B-17G, the latest variant intelligence suggested was entering service. "Gentlemen," Bach began, his pointer tapping the bomber's nose, 13 defensive positions, each mounting a Browning M2 50-caliber machine gun capable of 800 rounds per minute with effective range exceeding 1,000 meters. The diagram showed what German fighter pilots were beginning to encounter over Germany with mounting dread. Chin turret, twin 50 calibers in a powered mount beneath the nose, specifically designed to counter head-on attacks, the tactic Luftwaffe fighters had adopted as their safest approach. The chin turret eliminated that advantage entirely. Cheek guns, single 50 calibers mounted in flexible side windows of the nose compartment, covering forward oblique angles that the chin turret couldn't reach. Top turret, twin 50 calibers in a fully rotating powered mount directly behind the cockpit. Complete 360-degree coverage of the upper hemisphere, with the ability to track targets from dead ahead to nearly straight aft. This position alone made overhead attacks suicidal. Ball turret, the most ingenious and claustrophobic position, a fully rotating sphere mounted in the bomber's belly, containing a gunner, a computing gun sight, and twin 50 calibers. Complete lower hemisphere coverage, making attacks from below equally deadly. Waist guns, single 50 calibers on each side of the rear fuselage, covering beam approaches with overlapping fields of fire. Later variants staggered these positions to prevent gunners from interfering with each other. Tail turret. Twin 50 calibers in a powered mount at the extreme rear, covering the 6 o'clock position, traditionally the safest attack angle for fighters approaching from behind and below. Both used colored overlays to demonstrate the interlocking fire zones. Observe, a fighter attacking from 6 o'clock level faces the tail turret and both waist guns. 3 to 4 machine guns. 6 o'clock high, tail turret and top turret. 6 o'clock low, tail turret and ball turret. 12 o'clock level, chin turret, cheek guns, and top turret, potentially 5 weapons. Major Heinz Noak, a veteran fighter ace with 43 kills, studied the diagram with visible dismay. There is no safe angle. Correct, Herr Major, Bakke confirmed. Every approach vector intersects with minimum 2 gun positions, most with 3 or 4. And this analysis addresses a single bomber. He pulled down a second diagram showing a combat box formation. 18 B-17s arranged in staggered altitude groups. The overlapping fire created a 3-dimensional web of interlocking coverage. A fighter penetrating the formation faced not 13 guns, but potentially 50 or more tracking its approach simultaneously. The 50 calibers range meant this defensive sphere extended nearly a kilometer in all directions. "The Americans aren't flying bombers," Noak said quietly. "They're flying gun platforms that happen to carry bombs." Oberst Viktor von Lossberg, fighter operations commander, stood and approached the diagram. His finger traced an attack path, then another, then a third. Each time, multiple gun positions covered the approach. "Our pilots report that breaking up the formations is essential," von Lossberg said. "But how do we fragment a defensive structure this comprehensive without losing unacceptable numbers of fighters?" The room fell silent. Bakke had no answer. The mathematics were brutal. Each bomber carried 13 guns. A standard combat box of 18 bombers. 234 defensive weapons. A typical raid of 300 B-17s. Nearly 4,000 machine guns. Germany was sending fighters, armed with 2 or 4 guns each, against aerial fortresses that outgunned them 6 to 1 individually, and overwhelmingly when formations were factored. "They've industrialized aerial defense," Bakke concluded, "just as they've industrialized production." The briefing that truly shattered Luftwaffe confidence came not from test pilots or gunnery specialists, but from the intelligence section's industrial analysis team. Oberst Friedrich Weber, chief of enemy production assessment, delivered findings that transformed tactical concern into strategic despair. "Gentlemen," Weber began, distributing folders stamped "Geheim," secret, to the assembled senior officers, "our evaluation of the B-17 has focused appropriately on its technical capabilities. But the aircraft itself is not the primary threat. The threat is what it represents." He clicked the projector, and a photograph of Boeing's Seattle production facility filled the screen. Assembly lines stretched into the distance, each station holding a partially completed B-17. Workers swarmed the airframes like organized ants. Boeing's Seattle plant alone produces approximately 16 B-17s daily. Douglas facilities in Long Beach and Vega plants in Burbank add similar numbers. Combined American production, 300 to 350 heavy bombers monthly, with production accelerating. The numbers hung in the air like an indictment. Major Gunther Rahl, a fighter ace with 250 victories, did the arithmetic aloud. 12 B-17s daily means we must destroy 12 just to prevent the force from growing. That's before accounting for B-24 Liberators, which they're producing in even greater numbers. Precisely, Herr Major. Weber advanced to the next slide, a graph showing production curves. Current American heavy bomber inventory exceeds 6,000 aircraft. By year's end, intelligence estimates suggest 12,700 B-17s alone will have been manufactured. Total four-engine bomber production, including B-24s, will exceed 18,000 aircraft. General Adolf Galland, commander of German fighter forces, lit a cigarette with hands that weren't quite steady. Our current fighter production? Approximately 1,000 single-engine fighters monthly, Herr General. Total fighter inventory, all types, all fronts, roughly 2,400 operational aircraft. The silence that followed was suffocating. Weber continued with clinical precision. Let us examine the replacement arithmetic. When we shoot down a B-17, America replaces it within 3 days. When we lose a Bf-109, replacement requires a month, if sufficient airframes exist. Our pilot training pipeline produces 800 new fighter pilots monthly. America graduates 3,000. He paused, letting the implications settle. But the critical factor is this. American bomber production represents perhaps 15% of their total industrial capacity. They build these aircraft while simultaneously producing fighters, attack aircraft, transports, and training planes. They outfit forces in the Pacific, supply Britain and the Soviet Union, and maintain production reserves. Weber clicked to the final slide, a single sentence in bold type. American bomber losses are sustainable. Ours are not. Every B-17 we destroy costs them roughly $240,000 and is replaced within days, Weber concluded. Every Bf-109 we lose costs us 6 months of training, irreplaceable pilot experience, and diminishing fuel reserves we cannot replenish. The Americans can afford a 5-to-1 loss ratio. We cannot afford parity. Galland stubbed out his cigarette. You're telling us we've already lost. I'm telling you, Herr General, that we lost the moment American production reached full capacity. We're not fighting the 8th Air Force. We're fighting the industrial capacity of a continental economy that outproduces the entire Reich by factors we cannot match. Oberst von Lossberg studied the production graphs with the expression of a man watching his own execution schedule. Then every fighter pilot we send against these formations is simply delaying the inevitable. Weber closed his folder. Yes, Herr Oberst, that is precisely what I'm saying. The Luftwaffe's response to the B-17 threat evolved with desperate ingenuity. Each countermeasure showed tactical sophistication. None addressed the fundamental arithmetic. Head-on attacks became doctrine after early combat revealed the B-17's initial weakness: minimal forward-firing armament. Bf-109 and FW-190 pilots learned to approach from 12 o'clock high, diving toward the bomber formations with combined closure speeds exceeding 800 kilometers per hour. The tactic worked. German fighters could fire their cannon and machine guns into the relatively undefended nose sections, targeting cockpits and bombardiers before the defensive guns could track effectively. Until the Americans added the chin turret. The B-17G variant, entering service in late 1943, mounted twin 50 calibers in a powered turret directly beneath the nose. Head-on attacks transformed from advantageous to suicidal. Pilots who'd survived dozens of frontal assaults suddenly found themselves flying into concentrated defensive fire at point-blank range. Major Egan Mayer, who'd pioneered head-on tactics and achieved notable success, was killed in March 1944, shot down during a frontal attack on B-17s, whose chin turrets eliminated his tactical advantage. Rocket interceptors represented German technological desperation. The Werfer Granit 21, a 210mm rocket tube mounted beneath fighter wings, could destroy a B-17 with a single hit. In theory. In practice, the unguided rockets had effective range of only 600 meters and required precise aim from pilots simultaneously dodging defensive fire from dozens of bombers. Bf-109s and FW-190s hurting the rockets suffered degraded flight performance. The external tubes created drag, reduced speed and maneuverability, and made the fighters vulnerable to American P-51 escorts. Pilots reported firing volleys of rockets that missed entirely, then being forced to jettison the tubes and flee before Allied fighters caught them. Even successful hits barely dented American formations. Destroy one B-17, and 23 others continued to target. The mathematics remained merciless. Massed formations, Sturmgruppen, represented the Luftwaffe's final tactical evolution. Heavily armored and armed FW-190s flew in concentrated groups, accepting casualties to press attacks to point-blank range. Some pilots literally rammed B-17s after expending ammunition, sacrificing themselves to bring down a single bomber. The tactic produced results. On specific missions, Sturmgruppen destroyed significant numbers of B-17s, but the cost was catastrophic. Entire Staffeln were decimated in single engagements. Experienced pilots, irreplaceable men who'd survived years of combat, died in exchange for bombers that America replaced within 48 hours. By early 1944, Luftwaffe fighter losses exceeded 1,000 aircraft monthly. Pilot casualties mounted faster than training schools could replace them. Fuel shortages grounded squadrons. American P-51 Mustang escorts appeared in growing numbers, engaging German fighters before they could reach the bomber formations. And through it all, the B-17s kept coming. 300 bombers today, 400 tomorrow. Formations that darkened the sky, their contrails writing the inevitable across German cities. Recklin's technical evaluation had revealed defensive firepower and structural resilience. Combat revealed something worse. No tactical innovation could overcome industrial disparity. The Luftwaffe was fighting brilliantly, desperately, courageously, and losing by simple arithmetic because courage and skill cannot defeat assembly lines that produce bombers faster than fighters can destroy them. Germany had developed countermeasures for everything except American manufacturing capacity, and that was the one weapon against which no countermeasure existed. The final technical evaluation report on Wolfhound reached Luftwaffe High Command in August 1943. 63 pages of detailed analysis, performance data, structural examination, and armament assessment. But the conclusion distilled into a single devastating paragraph that senior officers would quote for the remainder of the war. Hans-Werner Lerck wrote it himself. The B-17 Flying Fortress represents defensive aerial firepower unprecedented in aviation history. Its structural resilience, systematic redundancy, and overlapping gun positions create a weapons platform that individual fighter aircraft cannot effectively counter. When deployed in formation, these bombers generate defensive fire concentration that transforms tactical engagement into mathematical attrition we cannot sustain. The report's classified annexes contained more candid assessments. Officer evaluations never intended for official distribution, but preserved in personal papers and post-war interviews. Oberst Heinrich Bauer, Recklin's commanding officer, wrote in his private journal, "We have evaluated enemy aircraft for 4 years. British Spitfires impressed us with maneuverability. Soviet Il-2 Sturmovix with ruggedness. But the B-17 inspires something different, a recognition that we are confronting not superior aviation technology, but superior industrial civilization. One fortress is a formidable challenge. 100 are a crisis. 1,000 cannot be stopped." Major Heinz Nock, the fighter ace who'd studied Recklin's gunnery analysis, confided to his squadron before a mission against B-17 formations. "Gentlemen, understand what you're facing. 13 machine guns per aircraft. overlapping fields of fire, armor that defeats our rifle-caliber weapons. And behind every bomber we destroy, 5 more wait in America. We fight not because we can win, but because we must. Even General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, whose public statements maintained confident rhetoric for morale purposes, privately acknowledged the hopelessness. In a classified memorandum to Reichsmarshal Göring, he wrote, "The defensive firepower of massed B-17 formations exceeds our fighters' offensive capability. Our pilots display exceptional courage engaging these formations, but courage cannot overcome the arithmetic of 13 guns per bomber multiplied by formations of 300 or more aircraft. We are asking our men to fly into defensive fire concentration that no tactical doctrine can adequately counter." Perhaps the most telling assessment came from the engineers who dissected Wolfhound bolt by bolt. Oberingenieur Martin Schilling, in his technical summary, abandoned the clinical language of official reports. The Americans did not design the B-17 to be the best bomber. They designed it to be a bomber they could build 12,000 of them. Every decision, the standardization, the redundancy, the overbuilding, the defensive armament, reflects a nation that wages war through industrial capacity rather than tactical excellence. We have built superior fighters. They have built sufficient bombers. In total war, sufficiency defeats superiority. The verdict was unanimous among those who'd studied Wolfhound most closely. Respect for American engineering, awe at their industrial capacity, and fear of what those combined forces represented. Germany could shoot down B-17s. German pilots proved that daily, paying in blood for every kill. But they couldn't shoot them down faster than America built them. And that single fact, more than any technical specification, any armament analysis, any performance evaluation, determined the outcome of the air war over Europe. The B-17 Flying Fortress wasn't invincible. It was simply inevitable. And inevitability, the German officers realized, was more terrifying than any weapon. Decades after the war, in quiet interviews far removed from the propaganda and desperate optimism of wartime, Luftwaffe veterans returned to the memory of Wolfhound with a clarity that only distance provides. Hans Werner Lerche, in a 1982 interview, recalled his first flight in the captured B-17 with the perspective of 40 years. "When I landed that day at Rechlin, I wrote in my logbook, 'Excellent stability, impressive engineering.' What I didn't write, what I couldn't admit even to myself then, was that I'd just flown proof of Germany's defeat. Not because the B-17 was invincible, it wasn't. Our fighters shot them down regularly. But because that single bomber represented an industrial philosophy we had no capability to match." He paused, choosing his words carefully. The guns were terrifying, yes. 1350 calibers creating overlapping fields of fire that made every attack approach lethal. But the truly frightening aspect was what those guns represented. A nation that could afford to add tons of defensive armament, accept the performance penalties, waste aluminum on crew protection, and still produce these aircraft by the thousands. We were building elegant fighters. They were building sufficient bombers. In total war, sufficiency always defeats elegance. General Lieutenant Adolf Galland, in his post-war memoirs, was more blunt. "The moment we captured that B-17 intact and our engineers examined it thoroughly, anyone with strategic vision understood the war's trajectory. We were fighting an enemy who could replace losses faster than we could inflict them." Every technical report from Rechlin confirmed what we feared. American industrial capacity operated on scales we literally could not comprehend. They weren't just outproducing us. They were operating in a different category of industrial civilization. Oberingenieur Martin Schilling, the structural specialist who'd led Wolfhound's technical evaluation, reflected in a 1978 technical journal, We German engineers prided ourselves on precision, efficiency, optimization. Every gram of weight mattered. Every component served multiple purposes. Then we examined the B-17 and discovered an engineering philosophy that seemed wasteful by our standards. Redundant systems, excessive structural strength, overbuilt components. But it wasn't wasteful. It was scalable. They designed an aircraft that semi-skilled workers could assemble rapidly using standardized parts. We were still handcrafting aircraft when they'd moved to industrial mass production. Even decades later, the assessment remained consistent among those who'd known the truth earliest. The B-17 itself wasn't Germany's defeat. The B-17 was the announcement of Germany's defeat, physical evidence of an industrial gap too wide to bridge through tactical excellence or technological innovation. The bomber that fell into German hands in December 1942 taught a lesson its designers never intended. Modern warfare is decided not by the quality of individual weapons, but by the capacity to produce those weapons in overwhelming quantities while simultaneously sustaining losses, adapting designs, and maintaining operations across multiple theaters. Germany built superior fighters. America built 12,731 B-17s. In the arithmetic of total war, the second fact mattered more than the first. Wolfhound, the captured fortress that German engineers dissected, that Lerche flew over Recklin's summer skies, that Luftwaffe officers studied with growing dread, ultimately served not as an intelligence breakthrough but as a mirror. And what it reflected was a truth German leadership had refused to acknowledge. They were fighting an industrial civilization they could not defeat, represented by a bomber they could shoot down but never stop. The fortress had announced the verdict. The war simply confirmed it.